Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back to the College of Health Sciences Doctoral Academy. And once again, I'd like to say that this is not exclusively for the College of Health Sciences. Any student can attend, and it's not exclusively for doctorates, except that some lectures are specifically for doctorates like today's. So if anybody is just an aspiring doctorate, a master's student wanting to think about a doctorate, today is for everybody, but specifically for those wanting to do a doctorate. Good. Today is being presented by both myself and Professor Richard Heft. Richard, would you like to say hello to everybody?
Yes, hello everyone.
Okay, so I'm going to kick off by just giving some background and going through the technicalities of what a doctorate is. I'm not going to talk specifically about the UKZN doctorate or a doctorate by publication, we're going to talk about doctorateness in general. To give you some background, if you have a look at the history of a doctorate, there are people who have found that there's evidence of doctorates being awarded in the 11th century and later on in the 13th century. But it wasn't until the 1800s that a doctorate became much more commonplace, particularly in Germany. And the kind of setup, please excuse my dogs, there's nothing I can do about them. The kind of doctorate that came about in the 1800s was to show that somebody had reached an academic level, the highest academic level attainable, in order to become a teacher, in order to teach at the highest level. So that is where doctor, I think, is the Latin word for teacher, has come from. So we come from a very short history of the PhD. And into the 1900s, the doctorate, the PhD, started to grow. More and more people, universities were offering it. In fact, we look at Oxford and Cambridge, they only really started awarding PhDs relatively recently, as with the big universities like Yale and Harvard and others. And in many of what were then colonies like New Zealand, Australia, etc., they didn't have doctorates at their universities. People used to do their research and the thesis would be put on a ship and mailed to Europe, and the doctorate would have been awarded at one of the old universities in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's a relatively short period of the academic doctorate. But what happened from about the 80s onwards has spurred us on to where we are today with the doctorate. Round about the 80s, people started to realize worldwide that the countries that were economically successful had the highest number of doctorates. So the interpretation, which I think is a false interpretation, is that if a country has lots of doctorates, you're going to be successful, economically successful. So there was a global push to increase the number of doctorates. It happened right across the globe, not only in South Africa, but we've all seen it very clearly happen where there's been motivation and carrots for universities to produce more doctorates. I can recall in my early academic career, those people going on to do a PhD were from relatively well-off families, and people who did not have to work and could pay heavy fees, and also who were lucky enough to get into a laboratory where there was some established research. Whereas as we moved from the 80s to the 90s into the 2000s, scholarships started to be provided for people to do their doctorates. And the whole motivation changed from an endeavor of curiosity to getting a doctorate. And we started to see in most countries, and South Africa didn't fall short of it, a kind of sausage machining in the early 2000s of PhDs. We saw cohorts being developed that weren't necessarily always successful. And that led us in about 2010 to the Academy of Sciences of South Africa reviewing the doctorate in South Africa. And that came in conjunction with a change in the National Qualifications Authority. They're defining what a doctorate should be. And the ASAF report raised several concerns about the doctorate in South Africa. And those concerns were that it seemed at that time to be exclusively a white male thing. There was very few other races and very few women getting PhDs at the time. And it was pointed out that that had to be addressed. And also the quality of the doctorate. There were questions about the quality of what should a doctorate be? We've had a relatively short period, 200 years of the doctorate, and there seemed to be an established standard given to the doctorate as a teacher. A few people, we had a mentor and a mentee, or a scholar with one or two PhD students, and suddenly that whole thing changed to people standing in front of a lecture hall full of students. So with that, the Council of Higher Education came out with a report, I think it was about 3 years ago now, where they defined various skills and competencies, knowledge competencies that were required of a doctorate. Now I'm going to go through these technical things, and the documents will be available on the website. I did show you last week where the website is and where you can access these documents, but I will show you the National Qualifications Framework. I will show you the ASAF report, and I will also talk to the CHE attributes. So that we're going to get a bit more technical now, so that at the beginning of your PhD, you know exactly what you should be aspiring to. Another thing I want to talk about is there are 4 things that are important when you consider your PhD. Firstly, it's a sacrifice of 3 to 4 years. We really do hope that the majority of students complete their work in 8 years. Research was done in the early 2000s to find that more than half the students who registered for a doctorate did not complete it. And many of those that did complete it in way more than 8 semesters. We've got to try and change that, because we don't want you treading water. So we've got to try and provide you with a framework to help you get through your PhD in 8, at most 10 semesters, if that's possible. So it's a big time investment on your part. Also, you've got to bear in mind that you're doing original research. And how do you know you're doing original research? It's because you start off your research by doing a literature review. And my personal preference is for a scoping review, because that is specifically aligned to show you where the gaps in the literature are, to show you where nobody has yet done any research. And original research does not mean a completely novel approach. You could be doing a study, repeating a study in a completely different context that had been done somewhere else before, and you'll be showing completely different results that will add to the human body, the knowledge of the body of knowledge that human beings are striving to improve all the time. So the point of those years and you doing original research is for you to gain skills. And the CHE document is a really good guideline to let you know what kind of skills you should be striving to achieve. And I'm going to go through those just now. And ultimately, what you're going to be doing in those years is gain those skills and produce a thesis that will show examiners how you have gained those skills beyond just what the original research that you are doing. So let me go into the technical side of things now. Okay, so there we go. So we're going to look forward now. We're going to look ahead from the time now where you are looking towards doing your PhD and what are the things that you need to gain in that time. But I want to also put it into the context of what you've learned already. Let's have a look at the different kinds of knowledge that exist. There is the explicit knowledge. That is the knowledge that is very easy to articulate. You can write it down and you can share it. So in your undergrad years, for example, you will use textbooks. You'll be gleaning explicit knowledge from those textbooks. Those textbook authors have shared with you what they have written. Then you move on to do something a bit more with that explicit knowledge, and that is called the implicit knowledge, where you take that explicit knowledge and you apply it. And here we hope to see you achieve that in your honors and master's years. To see if you learn about DNA, for example, and its shape and DNA sequences in your undergrad year, are you able to read a sequence by the time you get to your master's level? And then we have tacit knowledge. And that is the knowledge that is gained from personal experience. That is knowledge that you create through your research. So again, by the time you get to the doctorate level, you're becoming an expert and you are focusing here on tacit knowledge gain. So these are the three important documents that we have in South Africa. We have the National Qualifications Framework, or the South African Qualifications Authority, the ASAF report, the Academy of Sciences report from 2010, which I've alluded to, and the Council for Higher Education. So how do these all fit in together? And the reason I want you to know these things is that you don't get to think that it's just your supervisor who's got a whim about what you should be achieving in your PhD, that these are standards. And if you have a look at these standards from the Nqf to the CHE and you compare them to the Australian, the British, the American, you look at all the standards across the globe, you will see that they mostly all strive for the same standards, which is a good thing, because we want your PhD that you gain at UKZN to hold as much weight as another's if you are applying for a job in another country. So this is where things fit in. This is a complex looking diagram, but we have South African qualifications. We've got the South African Qualifications Authority over here. And then we've got the Council for Higher Education, which is a quality assurance body. So for quality assurance, the CHE has given us some guidelines, and these guidelines are very important to ensure that you're getting a full doctoral experience. Under these qualifications, we've got the Nqf Framework, and that Nqf Framework has got 10 levels at which knowledge and skills are grown. And I'm going to go into more detail on that now. Okay, my system is just deciding to go, but slowly, here we go. Now I'm going to move on. We've got 10. This is what the South African Qualifications Authority document looks like, the Nqf, and that is available on our website for you to look at. So these are the 10 levels. We've got from level 1, which is your general certificate. And if I remember correctly, I think that is given at the end of grade 5. And as we move up, the intermediate certificate, I think, is given at the end of grade 9. And then matric is at level 4. And then there are higher certificates and diplomas, and this is how you get some matric qualifications that don't get you a bachelor pass, they get diploma or higher certificate classes. And then we get the bachelor's degree, which is at level 7. And from there upwards, we only have 4 levels. It goes to the honors or the 4-year degree at level 8 and master's at level 9 and the doctorate at level 10. May I ask that you check that your mics are muted? I'm getting some feedback here. Please mute your mics. So within those 10 levels, they assess these 10 different aspects of knowledge. So for the level 1, this primary school level, they look at what scope of knowledge needs to be achieved in order to move from level 1 to level 2. What is the knowledge literacy meant to be? You look at all these things, problem solving, ethics. Even at primary school level, there's a level of looking at ethics. Accessing information, communicating information, managing learning, etc. All of these occur at every single level. What I've done here is I've just taken one of those aspects, scope of knowledge, to show you how it develops from matric through to doctorate. So only looking at scope of knowledge, and I urge you to download this document and have a look at the others for yourselves. So for matric level, there's a certain amount that is required. By the time you get to honors or MBCHB level, which is your level 8, we are requiring you to engage in the area, be at the forefront of the field, and have an understanding of how to apply the knowledge. So that's at level 8. Moving on to masters. So those of you who've done an MEd, we still require the engagement. We need a bit more than just being at the forefront of the field. You need to be able to critique current research and show some advanced scholarship. By the time you get to the doctorate, you definitely have to be in the forefront of your field, your discipline or your practice, and you must have the ability to conceptualize new research initiatives and create new knowledge or practice. So you've got to be at that level, right at the edge of new knowledge, that you are able to know what to ask, what hasn't been asked before. So this is how our national body has defined how a doctorate is different to a master's. Then there is the PhD study, the ASAF report, which is now 11 years old, but much of the critique still holds. And as a result of this study, we have the Council for Higher Education doctoral attributes. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. If you just read the executive summary of the PhD study, you're going to have enough information to see where we were in 2010 and why we need to be more cognizant of what is required of a doctoral student, what is required of us from the university to provide for the doctoral student, and what is required of you in order to make sure that you become doctorate. So this is the document also going to be available for you, the Council for Higher Education, and this is the qualification standard for the doctoral degrees. So as I mentioned earlier, this document came about as a result of the ASAF report and various other international movements, and it shows an enormous amount of international similarity, which is very comforting to know, because by the time you reach doctoral level, you want to be internationally mobile. You want to be able to present at international conferences at the same level as anybody who's qualified from any other country. We don't want to be the country bumpkins. And these are the knowledge and skills. There are 5 elements of knowledge that you need to look out for. And there are 4 skills that you need to work on. So let's have a look in terms of your knowledge. What is required of you in terms of knowing where your field is that you must have a broad, well-informed and current knowledge of your field or discipline. And this has been part of the doctorate for decades, for the last 2 centuries. You have to have done a literature review. Part of a thesis is a literature review to show that you are keeping up with current literature. And this is why I like to have in my students' thesis a scoping review, because you will keep that up to date as from the first time that you've assessed your literature right in the beginning and you do your literature review chapter. You keep up to date with your literature as you are writing the papers, because I'm a proponent of the PhD by thesis, by publication. And you keep up to date, your publications will have updated information, and your concluding chapter is going to show what has happened in the time that you have been doing research and what your research has contributed to the field. You have to show that you are expert, that you are specialized, and that you have an in-depth knowledge of your area. And that will come through in your papers, in your first chapter, and in your concluding chapter of your thesis. You must show the insight into the interconnectedness of your topic and other cognate fields. So this is more difficult in some areas than in others, but in medicine, we always have a related field. I'm going to mention one of our colleagues that might be in the audience now. Her thesis is looking at an epidemiology of a very rare disease, but she is cross-linking with the humanities research approaches by looking at how the caregivers cope with this cope with having to look after a child with this rare disease. And so there is an interconnectedness. We're seeing a qualitative research aspect as well as a quantitative, but they're very connected. It's a rare disease. It's an awful rare disease. It's often a lethal rare disease. And how do people cope? What can we do to help with the coping mechanisms? Then we look at ethical awareness. Ethics is an important aspect. And I'm not talking only about getting your ethics approval. Ethics is involved in the way you deal with your research life. It means making sure that you pitch up at your data collection points on time, that you respect all your participants, that the participants' information is kept discreet. So there's an entire ethical way of being that is required of you beyond just an ethics application. And then, of course, we've spoken about the original contribution to the field of study. So that's in terms of knowledge. We want to see your knowledge grow in those aspects. Then we also want to see skills. We want to see that you're able to evaluate, select, and apply various research approaches, look at different methodologies as you're going through, and look at other processes of doing your research project. We want to see some form of reflection and autonomy. A PhD is a lonely journey. It is your project. It's not your supervisor's project, well, unless you're part of a group, but it's for you to do with your supervisor, merely picket fencing a pathway for you to achieve it. But it's yours. Autonomy is very important, and reflection will allow you to grow. And when I talk about reflection, reflecting by writing is very important. Having a journal to monitor your reading is a very good way of reflecting. And reflection also helps you develop wiser thought. Then there's communication skills, and we're looking at digital literacy as well. And I cannot tell you how important digital literacy is becoming, how I'm beginning to battle because I cannot edit a YouTube video. I have to go and upskill separately. I can't just go and ask another specialist to upskill because they won't do it. You've got to actually keep up with technology, right through your PhD and beyond. And the communication skills are exercised from the level of your academic audience in the papers that you produce, in the thesis that you produce, in the conference presentations, either oral or poster that you produce. But also, we want to see people being able to communicate with the lay press, to be able to let your community know about your research and how your research is making a difference Or else people just see the university as an ivory tower that just sucks up money. It's a black hole for money, and nothing's coming of it. I would like to see, particularly my own students, start making an effort to make sure that the lay public know what we at UKZN are doing. And then critical and analytical thinking for problem solving. It's not an easy one to explain because critical thinking is something that comes with reading. Very often people start off their PhD believing everything they see in print. They see an article and they believe it. It comes from JAMA, therefore it must be a good article. Meanwhile, it might just be a total fraud. You've got to be able to look at things critically and evaluate them, and also in your context, evaluate for your context. Something might be the truth in India, but it's not our truth here. So those are the skills that you are to improve on and develop as you go through your 8 to 10 semesters of developing doctorateness. Right, so I'm going to give you some take-home thoughts, and then Prof. Heft is going to add to what I've said. And the one thought I'd like you to think about is, do you know what you need to become doctorate? You've seen those skills, you've seen how your knowledge has to be honed. Do you know what you still need to develop? I've met some PhD students who right up front have got such a fine critical thinking ability that that's not something we need to spend a lot of time on, but they might have serious issues in communication, and specifically in communication to a lay public. So analyze for yourself what you in particular may need. What questions do you need to ask yourself about your development towards doctorateness? Do you need to ask your supervisor for certain skills development? Because supervisors are human too. We make assumptions about people's skills and we may skip a thing or two. If you go to your supervisor and say you need some help in learning to write an article for a policy, for example, then at least your supervisor will know where to go and find something to help you develop that skill. Then also ask yourself, are you getting the best possible support to become doctorate? And this is where we're going to ask you to tell us what you need. The doctoral support, the academic, the Doctoral Academy is here to provide support outside of what your supervisors are providing you. So if you are feeling that you lack some form of support, that we are not providing it adequately for you, please do let us know and we will ensure that we include it in future Doctoral Academy talks. And lastly, what resources do you need to achieve doctorateness and where are you going to find them? Good, that's all I have to share with you today. I think I'm going to hand over to Professor Heft and then we'll have some questions towards the end of the talk. Thank you, Richard, over to you.
Thanks, Colleen. I always benefit myself from hearing you speak on that subject. Before I give my main talk, I just want to make a few general points for the Academy and really something
the research portfolio medical school
and appeal for help from our people. Right, so let me just share my screen. Right, there we are. And I just need to start the presentation. Okay. A minute or two, just a couple of points about our program. The basic structure of the program for this semester is now on the web. I'm just working on the website to make it look a little bit more attractive and easy to follow. We're using a standard university template and it's proving a bit difficult. A couple of points to make. Firstly, we have this excellent series of seminars that Colleen has put together on the Tuesdays and Wednesdays, the Tuesdays being largely about support, how to be a successful student, if I can call it that. And the Wednesdays more directly research-orientated, ethics, protocols, software to help you do your PhD, how to read a journal article, and so on. That's the one part of the program. The second is what I've called special activities, and we are putting together short courses. We've got to try and actually find the right balance between once off one afternoon a week type topics, as we have on the Tuesdays and Wednesdays, and then short intensive courses where people can get into something for 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 hours at a time. And we'd appreciate people's comments on how well we get that right. Well, the first one in March is my course on basic statistics. This will be about the 6th or 7th time I've done it now. I like to think it gets better every time, and people certainly seem to appreciate it. It's particularly designed for people who never did formal stats at university and find when they attend a statistics course that they come out not actually being able to say what it is that they heard or they learned. And a little bit later in the month, we're going to have a 2-afternoon session for master's students, both clinical MEds and MSc MEd Sci, just a basic introduction to master's research. Along the way, we'll also have occasional little seminars like tips from peers, where some of our students who are currently busy with PhDs will join us in a seminar and just share the hints and advice and things they've picked up as they work through it. Final point on this slide really is this indication of Mentor Week, and I'll talk in a minute about what that means. So there's the April program, and you'll see we'll have 2 short courses here. Understanding Qualitative Research and Introduction to Clinical Research. Each of those will consist of 2-hour sessions on each of 3 afternoons. We'd also appreciate hearing from our those who join us, whether they prefer 3 afternoons of 2 hours or to devote a full day to a 6-hour course. It really could go either way, and we may find that different groups have different needs. Turning to the next one, there we will have a course again, data handling and analysis. We'll have 6 hours on that. And then very importantly, what we've called the conference, presentation skills. And this is where we will be inviting our participants to volunteer themselves to present their work in an online conference. But this is not a standard scientific conference so that we can hear what you're doing. This is actually a learning opportunity about how to present and presentation skills. It's something that doesn't come naturally to most people, particularly the pressure of working under time, like only having 8 or 10 minutes to present. And nothing is actually sadder than seeing a student who's put years of work into their project and hours of work into their talk being cut off by the chair because their 10 minutes is up when they haven't even finished talking about the methodology. So this is the opportunity to discuss these things obviously in a friendly, non-judgmental, non-threatening way. So we'll start with a brief presentation on how to present verbally, and then we'll have these 2 sessions where people are invited to present, and we will provide feedback, gentle feedback, but hopefully for the benefit of everybody. So I'll put details of these short courses on our website shortly, as well as details on how to register for them. They are open to all. One of the advantages of the online format is that we don't have to limit attendance. So just click on the appropriate link and register. So that's the program. The second thing is, I'm a little bit too old to have actually done much in the way of participating in blogs and online discussion fora and things like that. But I've certainly followed it and seen it, and have seen that it can be extremely helpful, extremely enjoyable, and that many students thrive on being part of these online communities. So we'd very much like to see such a thing happen. but I'm well aware that there are people out there amongst you who probably know far more, or do know far more about this, are enthusiastic, and could help us set this up. It's something we'd really like to be something that's run by our participants. Now, we can provide the server space or something like that, whatever is necessary. But we would really like somebody who can help set it up and be a moderator and generally control the thing, turning to us for assistance where we can offer it, but otherwise getting on with it. It really ought to be a student-run thing. So blog immediately comes to mind. But those of you of a later generation than me will have other suggestions to phone-based communication apps and so on. So let me know. Please write to me. I'll put my email address in the chat, and with your suggestions, and also I'm really hoping there'll be some volunteers to help us set that up. Right. The final point just is mentorship. Mentorship is a relationship between a younger, more junior person and an older, more experienced senior person, where wisdom and guidance are shared, approaches to problems suggested, lives change, ways of thinking about the world altered, and so on and so on. It's very much this more experienced, less experienced partnership. But it's a partnership, and it's not a talking down to anybody. True mentor-menteeship relationship is really one of mutually respectful friends. So this is something we would like to get going, under the banner of the Doctoral Academy. The trouble is that what we have found over and over is that you can't make it happen. Assigning my name, for example, to a student's name very often may not work. We all have different personalities, and there'll be some sort of personalities that will thrive under my mentorship. And there'll be other personalities that will rapidly get frustrated and feel that they're not getting anything from me. For example, that I wander off philosophically far too much and don't tell them what to write in the next sentence of their thesis, that sort of thing. In which case they stop coming and the whole thing falls apart. So Colin and I are giving thought to this, and we'd like your advice on this too. What is the best way to allow the right mentors to hook up with the right mentees, which is the word we use for people who are being mentored? There again, if you've already established your own mentorship relationship, that's even better. Your mentor is not necessarily your supervisor. It's not somebody who tells you what to write down on the next sentence. Somebody who gives you general advice on dealing with a PhD, developing professionally, if necessary, dealing with personal problems in your own life, or whatever it may be, generally sharing wisdom, so that at the end of each session, you come out feeling that you've gained in wisdom about what works and what doesn't work, and about the world in general. And the mentor comes out similarly feeling fulfilled. One, that he or she has done something good and it's been appreciated. Secondly, that they've got to know another human being a little more deeply, which is always a very positive and instructive thing. And almost certainly, thirdly, that they themselves have learned something from the interaction. So that is the mentorship program. Would like to get something going, but it'll only work if you and your mentor hit it off and develop this deep respect for each other and this deep sense of sharing in a journey together. It can't just be a scheduled meeting. Dr. A will be available from 3 o'clock to speak to Miss B. So we're going to try and avoid that. Suggestions, please let us know. All right. Today's talk, what I decided to do was to share some thoughts and experiences I've just been having where I've been reviewing a protocol. Okay, this is a protocol about to be submitted to our ethics committee, and the school asked me to review the protocol before it's actually submitted. So I've done my best. I don't think it's identifiable. It's obviously, it must remain anonymous. These are the comments I made, many of them And I realized as I did so that this is the sort of comment that I make over and over and over again, not only at protocol level, but also in marking theses, revising theses, assisting people to write theses, write papers. It's the sort of things I see when I read the reviewers' comments on their papers, and the sort of thing I see when I read the examiners' comments on their dissertations. So let's just go through them. They really are from the sublime to the ridiculous. All these things in blue are actual comments that I have just written, in the margins of this protocol using track changes. It's standard practice not to spell out HIV and AIDS as human immunodeficiency virus in full, as they are such well-known abbreviations. That's not my opinion. It is written there in style guides for science. Be consistent with capitalization. It's best not to use capital letters in the heading, except for the very first letter. What I mean is a capital letter for each word of the heading, unless you make the entire heading uppercase. Et al. Must end with a full stop as it's an abbreviation, and written italics because it's a foreign language, meaning and others. Right. Another one, use heart or art consistently. In this particular protocol, it was sometimes heart and sometimes art, but meaning the same thing. So I suggested that both are okay, but I prefer the short one. And then the classic one, which you're probably aware of, but often forget to follow. Stick to the convention of spelling words out in full the first time you use them, followed by the abbreviation, and then only use the abbreviation for the rest of the document. This particular protocol, again, was littered with sometimes antiretroviral therapy in full and sometimes with ART, absolutely indiscriminately throughout the document. So what's my point? It's not just that I'm becoming peevish. Okay. The point is that there are standard rules in formal writing, and they are not optional. It's not up to you to design your own writing style. And here's a promise, not a threat. If you don't follow them, somebody is going to correct you. It might be somebody like me at your protocol stage, but from everything I see, you are going to get plenty of it from the reviewers of your papers and from your examiners of your dissertation. So might as well prevent this upfront. Just think how much time is wasted, because this is the sort of thing and we see in protocol after protocol, paper after paper, dissertation after dissertation. You write the incorrect thing, your supervisor, review examiner has to point it out and explain the rule to you, write out about et al. And full stops and italics, and then you have to correct it. And this is happening for every master's and PhD student in the whole college. If we add up to the amount of time that the college is collectively spending on correcting people on things like et al. And abbreviations and so on, it's probably hours and hours and hours a year. Not necessary. So take the trouble to acquaint yourself with these formalities and start to use them. I think one of the things we can start doing quite soon in our academy is actually just gathering these things together for you in a single place so that you can rapidly remind yourself. Such rules, in fact, cover a very wide range of items. If you ever wondered whether you must write human immunodeficiency virus or whether you can just call it HIV, there's a rule on that. The rule is it's so common now that HIV is regarded as a word on its own and you don't have to spell it out. Human papillomavirus with a capital or without capitals. The HMMBS gene, is it written with big letters, small letters, or italics? Should you start your sentence with the word 24 or the numbers 24? Should you report a number as 12.025 or round it off to 12.03? Should you write p equals 0.03 or p less than 0.05? And what about that p with all the zeros? There are rules for every single one of this, which are generally accepted, and you're going to have your reviewers and examiners pointing them out to you when you get them wrong and requiring you to correct them. So let's familiarize ourselves. And the final one, again, referencing, as described by Adams, superscript 14 full stop, or is it as described by Adams, full stop, superscript 14? And there are many, many more. The point is that you can save everybody, including yourself, an enormous amount of time by adapting your writing to these expectations. And that means familiarizing yourself with them and not making it up as you go. Right. And this, of course, one of the reasons why I've started off with this minor point that may seem is that this is something that applies at every single level of your PhD. From writing the concept note, to writing the protocol, to writing papers, to writing chapters, to writing the entire dissertation, whether in your first year or fourth year, these rules apply to you. The second point that came up in this particular protocol that I reviewed is a critical one because it goes right to the heart of potentially passing and potentially failing. So I wrote the important comment from the point of view of the PhD. It seems to me that there are essentially two objectives, and that in terms of publications, this work may result in at most two and possibly only one publication. Now, one publication if you combine the findings of both objectives, which you often have to do. This seems to me to be on the thin side for a PhD project. Working towards 3 objectives or papers is safer. And I made the point, this is not because there's a magic number of 3 you have to reach. It's just because in general, the sort of work that's sufficient for a PhD usually ends up with a publishable material for about 3 or more papers. So I just suspect that at the end of the day, this particular project may end up looking like 2 master's projects, 2/3 of a PhD, but not a whole PhD. Something to watch out for. And my advice here was, I strongly suggest that the candidate and his supervisor discuss this. The good news is there's actually no need to delay submission of the protocol. The work could commence, but they should be giving very serious consideration to adding an additional objective, which we can submit to ethics later. Okay, and all the time as the work proceeds, you and your supervisor should be continually assessing, is this enough work, or is my examiner going to fail the thesis as being good work, but insufficient in quantity contribution for a doctorate? Okay, just recently, I've had to advise a candidate who's already had their dissertation pass through 2 stages of examination and re-examination to withdraw completely. It became absolutely clear that the amount of work in that dissertation is just not sufficient for a doctorate. The examiners had clearly picked this up and were pointing it out very strongly, but hadn't come right out and said it. But it really looked irremediable, and it turned out to be a very sad case. The usual story. When the time came to do the study, all sorts of patients suddenly became non-available and all the rest of it. So the candidate ended up writing what they had, and it just wasn't enough in comparison with what they would have had if everything had worked out. Right. A third problem. This is something we'll be talking about repeatedly this year and every other year. Aims and objectives. Getting your head around aims and objectives seems to be one of the hardest parts of getting into the PhD. The research question, the hypothesis, the aims and the objectives. It's not something that comes easily. You already have to make the transition into the true scientific way of thinking to be able to formulate these correctly. And our clinically trained colleagues in particular really struggle and struggle and struggle to make this transition. So my comments on this particular candidate's protocol was, this is essentially a 2-step process, hence 2 objectives. First, the measurements are made, and then secondly, they are compared. It's not necessary to separate each comparison into a different objective. I've made up an example, but this is exactly what the protocol said, but obviously not in this trivial context. Objective 1, to record the vehicles entering the intersection and compare the blue cars and the red cars. Objective 2, to record the vehicles entering the intersection and compare the cars and the trucks. Objective 3, to record the vehicles entering the intersection and compare the private vehicles with official vehicles. And so it went on, for numerous objectives. Clearly, this is not only inelegant in terms of writing, but it's actually wrong logically. What it implies is that this candidate is going to, one, go to the intersection, count and compare the red and blue cars. They're then going to return to the intersection another time, count and compare trucks and cars. Return a third time, count and compare, and a fourth time and a fifth time. It's just not a true reflection of what they are going to do. What they mean is that they will go to the intersection, they will record all details of vehicles meeting their inclusion criteria. They will then go home, sit down with a nice cup of coffee, and do an extensive analysis of their data, looking for correlations across all those different groups, the red cars, blue cars, official cars, trucks, etc. So this should have been written as, to record all vehicles meeting the inclusion criteria entering the intersection, to correlate vehicle behavior with color, type of vehicle, official private status, gender of driver, and speed. Very clearly here, a wrong way of writing an objective and a right way. And it's not just a matter of style or following a rule, it goes right to the heart of your understanding of what you're doing. So the point I'm making here repeatedly is, I'm not teaching rules. There are sometimes absolute right and wrong ways to write things down, but there are almost always better and worse ways to do it. The better ways make your meaning clearer and show that you really grasp and know what you're doing. The worse ways make your meaning less clear and usually indicate that you yourself have not completely grasped what it is that you're doing. So to sum up, it's all about accuracy and clarity of your thinking. Much of the PhD, and Colleen will attest to this, is learning to think clearly. It's about clarity. Clarity in thought, clarity of expectation, what it is you really are going to do, and clarity in your expression when you talk about it or you write it down. Some of you would have seen this last year and you'll see it again. This is Alice in Wonderland with the Cheshire Cat. Alice says, will you tell me please which way I ought to go from here? And the cat says, that depends a good deal on where you want to get to. And Alice says, I don't really know where I'm headed. And the cat says, then it doesn't matter which way you go. Okay, this is often the problem with our masters and PhD students in the early stages. They don't really know what it is they're trying to achieve or do, and therefore they don't really know how they should set about doing it. And it's been beautifully summed up by an American folk hero and baseball player as, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. Right. So I cannot stress that enough, and we'll be talking a lot about understanding your objectives. Here's the fourth problem. The student has not read up or been trained or understood the terminology of research. So my comment here was, I think you've misunderstood the meaning of the phrase sampling strategy. It doesn't have anything to do with how you handle your tissue samples. You should read up on this and then label your sampling strategy correctly. And then I provided one reference. But the bottom line with all PhDs is, ask yourself the question, Google it, and within 30 seconds, you'll have 10, 15, 20, 30, 40, 50 different resources in which to look up what is sampling strategy, what is a list of sampling strategies, what does the term purposive sampling mean. One of the criticisms I've had of the people who attended our course, our academy last year, was quite a lot of people asking and waiting for us or somebody else to tell them what is a purposive strategy, instead of just going to Google and looking it up. And within a very short while, knowing it, understanding it fully, and in fact being something of an expert on it. And anybody who has recently read up on that subject is going to know more than I do. Because it's one of those things, I know it all when I read it, and a week or two later I remember half of it, but the other half has got forgotten. Right. This is what the student actually wrote. Sampling strategy. Samples will be drawn and stored on ice. They will then be transferred to a -60 freezer. What was meant, of course, was our sampling strategy will be blinded or purposive or random sampling or convenient sampling, which means, every single patient who comes to our clinic or whatever it may be. And this is well described in numerous pages on the web, as well as textbooks and things, and read it up. So if you're going to submit a protocol, you really do have to make sure that you know what they mean when they ask for sampling strategy, study location, study period. Study location refers to the part of the world where the study was carried out, Durban. Study period refers to the period during which patients were recruited or followed, not the period during which the subsequent work was carried out. This is the sort of thing that this particular candidate wrote in their protocol. Study location. Samples will be analyzed in the molecular laboratory at Harvard University. That's not the study location. The study location was King Edward VIII Hospital, Durban, South Africa, because that's where the patients came from, and therefore the results are applicable to those patients. They're not applicable to the people living near Harvard University. And similarly, the study period. It became clear to me that recruitment ended in December 2020. This is actually a project using samples that have already been taken and stored away. Okay. So you can't say that the study period continues to December 2024. That might be when the lab work will all be finished. But the patients are the sort of patients that were seen between January 2020 and December 2020. That's the study period. And this, again, is not just some obscure rule. This is actually a critical point. We're interested in study location and study period because it gives us the context. So if somebody reads your paper and says, I wonder if this will apply to my patients, they'll have to say, well, it applied to people who lived in Durban in the period January to December 2020. And then they must ask themselves, is there any reason why my patients living in New York in October 2023 should be any different to those living in Durban? And if you think the answer is not, then you can probably apply the research to your own patients. If you think the answer is yes, they are very different, then you'll be extremely careful about applying it. Right. If the population were to change after 2020, then the conclusions drawn from our study may no longer be valid. Okay, and I'm going to give a sort of silly, simple example of that. Let's say we conduct a study of gender discrimination in our universities. We sample our students from January 2023 to December 2024, and in July 2026, we are ready to publish it. However, in the 2025 election, South Africans inexplicably vote the Taliban into power in this country, who immediately ban all women from attending university with immediate effect. So suddenly our findings no longer apply to South African universities. There are no women in them, so by definition, there can be no gender discrimination. Our findings were only valid for the pre-2025 context. So it's essential that people know that our study ran until the end of 2024, so that they will know that those findings which were true then do not necessarily apply here. The next problem, again, this is a common one. There are combinations throughout this protocol of past tense and future tense. Patients will be recruited, but I know that recruitment has finished. The samples were all stored away last year already. The student has got confused now as to whether for ethics they are writing as though the project hadn't started what will be done. In fact, the truth of the matter is they've got to tell the truth about where we are now, which is that the samples have been taken and we are now about to start molecular biological studies. Okay. It can also be a very important issue in terms of determining whether this is a good PhD in terms of passing or failing or not. If it were to turn out that all the work has been done and the candidate is merely taking it up at the point of doing the analysis, then one might want to ask oneself, is this really a PhD-worthy project? On the other hand, if the samples were stored away, but the candidate is going to drive all the experimentation and the laboratory work and the analysis, then that could well be sufficient for a PhD. And of course, if the project hasn't started at all, and the candidate will be doing the whole lot from recruitment through, then there's absolutely no doubt about this. So this issue of whether you use past or future tense is not some style matter that you've got to learn. You've actually just got to tell the truth about what has been done already and what will be done. Right. So I pointed this out to this particular candidate. You're writing this as though it's still something that's going to happen. The patients who recruited previously in the samples are now stored that already had ethics approval. What you need to report now is how many samples are stored and available, and how you're going to divide these up between patients. And you must then say whether you're going to use all of them or whether you'll be studying only some of the stored samples, and if so, how you will choose these. All that is the sort of information that's essential for the reviewer and for the ethics committee to decide whether your work will be of an appreciable standard at all. And another point I have to make at all stages, if you get it wrong at the protocol stage, it's highly likely that it will remain wrong at the stage of writing up your dissertation. And you will find yourself in danger of failing your PhD on the grounds of poor science. So just bear that in mind. Okay, so patients were recruited, patients will be recruited, samples have been analyzed or samples will be analyzed. It's not a matter of some convention about past and present. It's about truth and it's about accuracy. And then the final problem, methodology, recruitment, inclusion criteria. Bits of methodology were written under recruitment. Things were put under inclusion criteria that weren't inclusion criteria. For example, it said HIV positive patients on heart, but they also recruited HIV negative patients. What I think they meant was patients with HIV will only be recruited if they are on heart. That's quite different from saying HIV patients on heart will be recruited. So there's an awful lot of difference in the meaning of these things, entirely dependent on the words that you choose. And the final one, a rather worrying one, because again, I have seen theses, dissertations fail at this stage, and papers get thrown away when it's quite clear that no journal is going to accept it. Weaknesses of the study. I find that very often, candidates feel they've just got to write something down. So as long as they've written something down as a weakness of the study, they think they're okay. Here my comment was, I hinted at this earlier and it needs much more information. Not having done an accurate confirmatory HIV as opposed to a rapid test, it's not just a weakness. It may potentially result in patients being wrongly assigned in terms of group. If you haven't done an accurate test, you may have people who are HIV positive in the group that you call negative and the other way around. That is quite enough to completely distort your statistics and absolutely invalidate your research. It may be a weakness. The question is it a fatal weakness? And it may indeed be a fatal weakness. So I had to ask, do you have any idea how many such patients there are? And what will you do to minimize the chance that this will introduce errors? And I finished off by writing there, if there's a real chance of introducing errors, then it is actually best to exclude patients without this critical information. Many students have got it in their heads now that a larger sample size is better. Not true. A smaller sample size with more accurate information is usually far better than a larger sample size with less accurate information. And I cannot tell you how many times I've looked at a student's sample of 200 and suggested that they throw out 140 of those patients and combine the analysis to the remaining 60. As soon as you have bad information, your chances of actually finding genuine statistical differences and meaningful, correct interpretations goes way down. So don't just throw away potentially fatal problems under the heading, oh, well, I did write it down as a weakness of the study. If it's that weak that it could invalidate the study, then you better start thinking again. And as I've written down at the bottom here now, this point marks the border between good science, i.e. pass the PhD, and bad science, i.e. fail the PhD. Right. If any of our students pass the PhD, but are incapable of distinguishing good science from bad science, or in the habit of practicing bad science, then we as an institution have failed extremely badly. It's the equivalent of us passing a medical student, MBCHB, who then proceeds to make the grossest errors and kill patients. It's just not acceptable. Right. But my final overall comments. What I wrote to the candidate is, the protocol is coming right. This was the second draft. And the project looks interesting. You should not be discouraged. And this is something I'll be saying to you over and over and over again. In my opinion, 40% of the learning of the PhD goes into understanding what's in the protocol. That's where you learn to think like a scientist, that clarity I talked about, that true understanding of what is a research question, hypothesis, and objective, understanding the strengths and weaknesses of different sampling strategies, being able to recognize a minor weakness in a study from a potentially serious or even fatal weakness. All of this emerges in the protocol. It's far too late for these sort of things to be learned 3 or 4 years down the line. So my request to this candidate was, as they read my comments, they should see my contributions as learning opportunities, not as criticisms or finding fault or telling them that they don't know what they do. Right, and that's really where I'd like to end.
Many thanks for that, Richard. I think that the point made that the protocol is a big learning experience is a very valid one. And I think it could be 40%, it could be 60% sometimes. So I'm going to open the floor for questions. If you'd like to just put up your hand, and then we can allow you to speak in the order that we see hands. If you go to reactions at the bottom of the screen, you can select a hand. Nobody wanting to ask anything today? You're all still here. Okay, let me just reiterate then that the Doctoral Academy is here to serve you. So if you could please let us know what your needs are. We have come up with a program based on our experience as supervisors over several years, but there may be things that we are completely blind to. So we've got talks for the whole of the first semester. We can always tweak things on your suggestion for the second semester. Okay, if there are no questions, I'm going to thank you for attending. Next week, Professor Naina Amin. Hello? Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am
Yes.
Domengo Sobandu. I just wanted to know, will we have an opportunity of getting to learn on how to conduct a scoping review, probably starting with the research strategy? Thank you.
I think we should have a short course on that. It's not something we can look at in an hour. I think I'll make a note of that, and we might run a short course on that in June, maybe. June, we've got an ACRIMO, but we can always run a separate one for scoping reviews. But what I could do is I could send Professor Hift the relevant literature, and that can go on the website, if we can put it into a folder, the latest literature and what a scoping review could look like for those who need the information more quickly. Thank you for that suggestion. Yes. Any other suggestions or questions? How to register a protocol. I think that we'd have to find somebody. Richard, do you know anything on how to register a protocol? I think there are some sites where you register your research, but I think it's a very particular kind of research. Okay, I'm going to make a note of that.
I have to know exactly what they mean by registering. The word could be used in many different senses.
Yeah, I think there are some sites where you can publish and register your protocol. It actually gets published with a DOI. We can have a look at that. Scientific writing.
Many journals now will not publish unless the protocol was previously put up there. It's one way that they can check that people didn't make it up, after the fact and write a fraudulent paper.
Yeah, so I'll make a note of that. Scientific writing, yes, we've got the whole of June. We're looking at how we're going to write a paper. So you can attend the Wednesdays and we'll go through each different section of a scientific paper, and there'll be 2 evenings a week run in parallel where you will we'll all write together as a group. For you, sir?
Hi, Prof. Thanks. I just wanted to perhaps help on that sites registering for protocols. I know for when you wanted to write a protocol for systematic reviews, there's actually Prospero. That's the acronym for the site for registering, and you actually register. So even actually before starting a systematic review, you need to check Prospero to see that it hasn't been carried out before. And then you need to register. There's actually sort of guidelines, stepwise guidelines on how to, on what information they need and how to register your protocol for a systematic review.
Okay, thank you for that. I do know that there's also, there are other sites for experimental protocols as well, that you can actually get a publication for some of them. I don't think we're going to go into different kinds of statistical software, but we're going to go into the stats. Okay. Good. I've made a note to look at, I see you meant not scoping review, that you wanted a full review, a systematic review. I will look for information on that. And if we can't run a talk, if we can't find somebody to speak on it with authority, we will find literature and put that onto the website. Good. Are there any final comments, thoughts, or questions? Okay. Good. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Next week, as I started saying, Professor Naina Amin will be talking to us about qualitative analysis, right? Yeah, we're going to be looking at all the different kinds of paradigms in qualitative work, because there's a whole lot of research that we can do in clinical science that involves qualitative research too. I've had some very successful PhDs that have included both quantitative and qualitative work, and I've relied on people who know their topic, who know how to include how to work with qualitative data. So it just leaves me to thank you all. Thank you to Professor Hift for contributing, and thank you for attending. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very much.